Welcome to the Doyenne of Death podcast, funeral planning for those who don't plan to die. It's all about end-of-life issues and getting the conversation started about our 100% mortality rate. This series is hosted by Gail Rubin, certified thanatologist and the Doyenne of Death. A doyenne is a woman who's considered senior in a group and knows a lot about a particular subject. So here to talk about the subjects we sometimes avoid is author, speaker, and the Doyenne of Death, Gail Rubin.
Welcome. I am so excited to have a funeral director friend of mine, Todd Harra, who is also a multi-published author. Todd is the author of his newest book, which we're going to be talking about here today, LAST RITES, The Evolution of the American Funeral. Fascinating history book, all about death and funerals. He's also the author of Mortuary Confidential, Undertakers Spill the Dirt, and Over Our Dead Bodies, Undertakers Lift the Lid. Hello, Todd.
Hey, Gail. Thanks for having me on your first show.
Yes, this is the Doyenne of Death podcast, kicking off with an excellent conversation with you. This book is so fascinating. Plus, I love, these are the bookmarks that come with the book. Little coffins. Let's right off the bat tell our listeners, our viewers, what's the difference between a coffin and a casket?
Oh my gosh, Gail, nothing makes me wince more than when I'm watching the news or something, and a newscaster says the word coffin. You know as well as I do, coffins are very rarely used in America anymore and haven't been for the past 150 years. The difference is the number of sides. So the bookmark you're holding up has 6 sides plus a top and a bottom. A casket has 4 sides plus a top and a bottom. Every once in a blue moon, we'll get a family that has bought a coffin that's made by the Trappist monks, or somebody like Chuck Lakin up in Maine who makes coffins and puts his designs up on the internet for free for anyone that wants to try their hand at making their own coffin. But I would say I've been doing this 18 years and probably seen maybe 4 coffins. They're very, very rare in America.
Yes, yes. Well, and you work in the family business, McCrary and Harra Funeral Homes and Crematory in Wilmington, Delaware. And I want to know, so you wrote this book, Last Rites, during the pandemic. And did you have a lot of death going on in Delaware that you had to serve a lot of families, or you had a lot of time to write?
We were just like every other funeral home. Maybe certainly not as bad as New York, but we were overwhelmed at times, and the lack of information in the beginning as to what exactly COVID was and how you contracted it, made things a little bit, scary. As, oh my gosh, am I going to bring this home to my family? So it was certainly a sigh of relief when they rolled the vaccine out. But those newscasts of people, hospital attendants in their full PPE with the hoods and the masks and everything, taking body bags out to refrigerated tractor trailers. Those were real. I mean, those were real scenes. They weren't, ginned up in some Hollywood studio. And, frankly, it was sad what was happening, the amount of people that were dying due to COVID. And, if I never see anything like that again in my career, I'll be very thankful. It was scary time.
Mm. Well, in Last Rites, you are looking at the entire span of history as it applies to what we do in funeral service in America these days. Like, how did we get here? But you go to not only ancient Egypt, of course, where embalming was first invented, but the Roman Empire, medieval Europe. There's so many different ancient influences that we don't even know as just your average American actually come into play. There was something I read about an ancient Roman funeral rite that has morphed into the tradition of doing a photo montage at a funeral. Can you explain that?
So I think you're talking about the family ancestral masks that the families would trot out and essentially have a parade behind the decedent on their way to either being cremated or buried, depending, which part of the Roman period you're talking about. But the mask would be made and worn by a person who would essentially assume the role of the decedent in their own funeral cortege, and then that mask would be saved as a family heirloom and venerated, and so you'd have grandmother, great grandmother, great grandfather, all their funeral masks being worn during these funeral corteges that are winding through the streets, so you could see the whole family tree as part of as the funeral cortege. And I kind of likened that to how people like to connect with their family tree in the modern sense that they'll do the photo boards, or we'll do the the photo montages on the TV when you're coming in. And a lot of people, I feel like, try to draw in every family member, so no one's left out. So in the same way, the Romans would have these ancestral masks that they'd wear during the procession. You have families now doing a very similar thing, connecting with their familial roots through the modern photography.
That is so cool. And one of the aspects of a funeral is usually having something to eat and drink. And I was amazed at the scope of funeral feasting that you describe, both in the ancient days as well as early America, including alcohol. Apparently that was very big in early American funerals. You want to talk a little about that?
Yeah, I think that probably the biggest surprise for me about early American funerals was the cost of the funeral. Today, funerals are a big purchase. It's on par with buying something large like a car. But looking back, 200-300 years, they've actually gotten cheaper compared to people's net worth. A colonial funeral, it was not unusual for the funeral to cost 1/5 of the person's entire estate. And most of that cost, and when I say most, I mean 90 to 95%, were wrapped up in two things: the funeral gifts and the repast. The coffin might cost 4 or 5% of the total funeral bill. So there's definitely a difference between contemporary funerals and colonial funerals, in that the portion of the total funeral bill that's made up by the repast has shifted drastically. But families had friends and family members coming from distances over colonial roads. Travel was not easy, and people expected to be fed and lubricated with booze. And a lot of these funerals I was reading about is they would break open what were called pipes of wine. So barrel sizes are all, I learned barrel sizes are all different. You've got the hogshead and this, that, and the other thing, and they're all different size, but the pipe of wine is 126 gallons. And I read more than one funeral, the families were busting open a pipe of wine for the funeral meal. So think about how much wine these people were consuming, and they would basically, just float home. And this was one of the few occasions in puritanical America that drinking was not only allowed, but it was, kind of condoned and, encouraged. And there was this, I'll call it a colonial colloquialism. That's kind of fun to say. That when parents, had a baby born, they would start saving wine either for its wedding or its funeral. And that kind of, really hit home with me. Like, wow, it was just very surprising to me that I had never read about the importance or the prominence of the repast in any of the, funeral history books I had to read for mortuary school.
Well, and you also mentioned funeral gifts. That's something that I don't think we really have much of in this modern age, but it was quite popular with the Victorians and I guess even during the colonial period.
I make reference to, I think, Gail, there is a vestige of the funeral gift in the modern funeral in the form of a prayer card. In some areas of the country, it's called the memorial folder. You've probably also seen like the seed packets, or, some families will bring some kind of special little unique gift, like a polished stone or something like that. There's really nothing comparable to the lavish, expensive gifts given out in the colonial funerals. I mean, they were luxury goods, stuff that was very expensive, gold rings, gloves, fabric was very expensive, scarves, bottles of wine, books. So things that were very kind of rare and expensive were given out as gifts to the mourners that came to the funerals. Sure, the 10 cents of paper that the prayer card was printed on can't even kind of compare to a gold ring. But I do kind of make that connection. That is the direct descendant of the funeral gift in contemporary America.
And actually, in a way, I've been to funerals or memorial services where they'll bring the deceased library of books and basically say, take a book, take 3 books, as a downsizing measure, but also sharing,
Yes,
a memento of the person. How
Absolutely.
about...
And I see all sorts of clever things like that. And I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, let's talk embalming. You are an embalmer and a reconstruction expert. There was a story in the section about embalming about Dr. Martin Van, is it Butchell? B-U-T-H?
Butchell, yeah.
Butchell and his embalmed
ELL,
wife.
Yeah.
And that had some significance in the development of our current funeral practices. Can you tell that story just a little bit?
Sure. So Dr. Van Butchell was well known for his very, shall we call them, unique marketing techniques. He would ride around the Mayfair section of London on a white pony that he put purple spots on. And Dr. Van Butchell was a dentist of some repute and also a truss maker. So he would make these bands for people that had herniated, in kind of an attempt to hold them together. And apparently he was very good, or well known, shall we say, for both of them. But when his first wife, Maria, died, and I couldn't pin this down exactly, but I did read a couple things that he was able to stay in charge of some property of hers if she remained above ground. So he called the Hunter brothers, who were well-known Scottish anatomists, and had William Hunter and William Cruikshank, who was also a famous surgeon, come over to embalm his wife. And Dr. Van Butchell recorded in his diary he participated in the embalming, which, God bless him for that. But he took part in the embalming, and there are notes of the exact procedure, so we know exactly what was done. But it was a 3-day procedure, and at the end of the procedure, he put his wife in a case with some sort of glass covering, and people found out that this man has displayed his wife in his parlor. And so all sorts of people started flocking to his home, not just common people, but, the landed gentry and even royals were coming in. So many people were coming and knocking on Dr. Van Butchel's door that he had to post a sign with essentially calling hours for people to come in and see his wife. And it just became a very, very famous case. And even when he married again, he married one of his servants, became his second wife, and she protested about the first Mrs. Van Butchel being on display in their parlor. But it wasn't until he died that his second wife had her moved to a museum, where she remained until a bombing raid during World War II destroyed her remains. So she was on display for almost 200 years, but it just was a very famous case that kind of propelled this obscure anatomical science of embalming into the public's kind of the forefront of their mind, and kind of ignited this curiosity with embalming. Mrs. Van Butchel certainly was not the first, case of embalming in medieval Europe, but I think she certainly is an early famous case.
This was, I think, in the 1700s?
Yes, late 1700s. I think it might have just been just before around the time of the American Revolution.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, because what we know here in the United States is during the Civil War, the use of embalming exploded with these surgeon doctors who would sell coupons that primarily Northern soldiers would have in their uniforms pinned inside their jackets. So if they died on the battlefield, they could be embalmed and shipped back to their families. But you've got so much detail about that. The railroads refusing to ship bodies that were decomposing, and it just, the whole Civil War was such a huge impact on this country, on the United States, and how we treat our dead. And the military. Why don't we talk a little bit about that? You had some great history about the mortuary services for the military and how that evolved. I guess I remember the parts about the Civil War. Did you have any information about the Revolutionary War?
I did not. I didn't come across anything. At the beginning of the American Civil War, the government had no plan for what they were going to do with the fallen. And that's why these embalming surgeons kind of, there was this proliferation of embalming surgeons because the families were hiring them to, find their loved ones, because a lot of times they were buried on the battlefield by their friends, and then embalm them and ship them home. I mean, the government was not doing any of the services it provides today. A lot of times these quote unquote agents, that's what they'd call these people that would go out and find soldiers for the families and the embalmers. They were going out days or weeks after the battles, once the field had been cleared of, live soldiers, either pursuing the enemy, whoever it may be, or, running in retreat. So, sometimes it might take days for an army to leave the field of battle and people to actually get out there and start searching. But towards the end of the war, the Civil War is kind of when we see the turning point of the American military, start to care for the dead. We have the creation of, the government cemeteries that Abraham Lincoln authorized, and charged Montgomery Meigs, who was the head quartermaster, with creating these cemeteries. And then towards the end of the war, we see, the government start to take over some of those duties, as far as, they were essentially inspecting and vetting the embalming surgeons by the very end of the war. And then at the very end of the war, you see Grant issue this order that any Union surgeons will embalm a Union officer at no charge. He was so fed up with some of the antics that the embalming surgeons were doing and causing problems with the Army, that this was his way of kind of taking their teeth. And if a family has a choice, okay, am I going to get this for free or have to pay for it? Of course, they're going to go with the Union surgeon who's going to perform the embalming for free. And then from there, over the next few wars, we see that the military get more and more involved, with the recovery of the dead and returning them to their families.
Yeah, I learned about the Purple Cross. I had never heard of that.
That was not a military organization. And, I think it's kind of been forgotten by history, but two guys, one of them was Mr. Eccles, who ran the Mortuary College that was here in Philadelphia for years, I think until the 1950s. And a newspaper man by the name of J. Mowbray, came up with the idea of the Purple Cross to return World War I doughboys back to American soil. And, they went to the military and said, listen, we'll train these people, we'll provide the equipment, we'll fund the entire operation. And the military essentially turned them down flat and said, no, thank you. And at this point, they had created the GRS, the Graves Registration Service. And so during World War I, they did a great job of, identifying the servicemen. I forget the exact statistic, but, it was close to 99% that they were able to identify, and they would put the person's name in a glass bottle and bury it with the person. And there was hundreds of these little scattered cemeteries around Europe at the conclusion of World War I that they then condensed into, I forget the exact number, maybe 6 fields of honor across Europe, where they, moved all the servicemen whose families wanted them to remain over there. At the end of World War I, the family had a choice. They could either have their loved ones' remains repatriated back to America, or lie, in European soil with, their comrades in arms.
And I'm guessing it was World War I when dog tags got introduced, and that might have helped.
Yeah. Dog tags were issued as a standard piece of equipment then, but I don't know if you've ever come across this, Gail, but some Civil War soldiers had dog tags. Harper's Weekly would sell them, and the soldiers quickly realized that paper can get wet or torn out, and a lot of these guys would be stripped of their their good clothing by the enemy, who wanted oh, this is a nice coat. So they quickly learned to either purchase one of these metal tags from Harper's and wear it on their person around their neck, or if they couldn't afford that, they would carve their name into a little piece of wood and wear it around their neck.
Oh, wow. Yeah. What one of the stories that you shared was about the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which came out of World War I, and how that soldier was chosen to represent all of the unknowns.
So that soldier was chosen by a combat veteran. General Pershing wanted, a regular doughboy to pick the unknown, not, one of the officers or, somebody quote unquote important. He wanted somebody who had been in the trenches slogging it out. So what they did was they exhumed 4 cases from 4 of the different cemeteries and made sure that this person, first of all, was an American soldier, and 2, was completely unidentifiable, either by their rank, their, what unit they served with, they didn't have any personal effects. This person was truly unidentifiable. And then they brought all the 4 caskets into a chapel, and this soldier, and his name escapes me right now, went in with a bouquet of white roses and walked around them one time, and then picked one, laid the bouquet of roses on the casket, saluted, and left. And that's how the unknown soldier was selected. And then the 3 who weren't selected were taken back, and they weren't buried in the cemeteries where they came from. They were all buried in the same cemetery.
So one of the great things about Last Rites, your book, is I learned things. As the Doyenne of Death, I thought I knew most of what I needed to know, but the word for pallbearers is not what I thought it was, and that the pall and the bearers are actually 2 different things.
That's right. That's right. In colonial America, typically the grave was walking distance from the house. It was either, a family plot that was, in the backyard, or it was maybe the common green, the town's square, or an abandoned lot where people were burying folks. Bottom line, it was someplace that was walkable. And the pallbearers were older gentlemen in the community who literally held the pall in place on the coffin as it was taken to the grave plot. The people that did the actual work were the underbearers, is what they were called. And if it was a distance from the home to the grave, they would have a second set of underbearers to accompany the coffin. And in keeping with the funeral tradition of funeral liquor, I think it was smart a lot of times to have a second set of underbearers, if the first set had imbibed a bit too much.
But so the pallbearers were actually these older guys holding onto the corners of a piece of fabric over the casket. And in this day and age, when you say pallbearer, it's people actually grabbing those handles and carrying it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's changed a little, and I like to make kind of this comment that the average life expectancy for males in Salem in 17th century was 30 years old. So what's an older person of the community? I would have been dead and buried years ago by that standard. So, I don't know how old the older people in the community were, but it probably was what we'd call middle-aged these days.
Thanks for listening. This is part 1 of our 2-part episode. Stay tuned for part 2 coming next week.
Thank you for joining us on the Doyenne of Death podcast. You can find episodes of this podcast and past episodes of A Good Goodbye with Gail Rubin on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. For more information on Gail's work, visit agoodgoodbye.com.